Welcome to everyone already on today's webinar. We're going to give people just a couple more minutes to log in before we get started. Thank you for your patience. Webinar for this quarter, the latest updates in the Sage Intacct 2018 Release 2. I'm Megan Manrique, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use the webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side will let you toggle the control tray open or closed on your GoToWebinar. At the bottom of that control tray, you'll also see a chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar via the chat function, and we should be able to get back to those towards the end of the webinar. And actually, I noticed that we're experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties. We'll get those slides back up for you in just a moment. Sorry about that, folks. All right, so we should be back in order here. So also on your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option. And alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option. And lastly, I would like to note that today's webinar is being recorded. So we'll send out the slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording of the webinar within about 48 hours. So definitely keep an eye out for that message if you're interested in accessing the webinar after today or sharing it with any of your colleagues who couldn't make it with us live this afternoon. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. First up is Brenda, who is a senior manager on the Sage Intacct team here at Armanino. She has over 20 years of accounting experience in Big Four public accounting and in-house as a controller, where she led a Sage Intacct implementation for a large global nonprofit. Additionally, we have Greg Block with us today, who is a director on Armanino's Sage Intacct team and has over 30 years of accounting experience, also including Big Four public accounting, Fortune 500, and as a CFO controller for several mid-market companies. I'd like to welcome you both. It's great to have you both with us here today. And with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to them to get us started.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So today we're going to cover, there's a lot of updates in this release. So we're going to cover reporting and administration, accounts payable, contracts, the Salesforce integration, platform and web services, purchasing, projects, inventory, and global consolidations. Okay, so first we're jumping right into reporting and administration. So there's a number of changes related to both of these things in the current release. So first of all, the biggest one you've probably all noticed if you are using the beta UI, which I encourage everybody to do. That's the new Action UI. And there's a number of features that are now only available in Action UI that you might want to check out. So this is an individual setting. You can toggle back and forth by person, and you can do it for a workflow and then go back to the old one. I do encourage you to get in there and start using this new new UI as soon as possible, because Intacct will at some point force switch everybody over there. The nice thing about it is while you still have access to both, Intacct has rearranged the menus in the new UI. So it gives you the chance, if you can't find something on the menu, switch back into the old UI, navigate to that, and then switch into the new UI, and you can see where you are. So it provides a great mapping for the old menu to the new menu. However, once Intacct forces everybody over to change, that option will no longer be available to you. So you'll just have to kind of figure it out where it is without having that being able to switch into the legacy UI. So the first big change that they made is previously they had, similar to the legacy UI, they had listed all of the modules across the top. And then they had the menus down the left-hand side. And the problem with that was that you couldn't peek the menu. You couldn't hover over the menu and see the listing of all of the things. And the other issue was that you had to scroll to see everything on the menu, which really made it difficult to find what you were looking for. So Intacct really listened to all of the feedback that they received on that, and they did a little bit of a hybrid between the two options. So now we've got an application switcher. So when you first log in, next to the home button, you're going to see applications. As you pick an application, that will change. So it'll change to accounts payable when you actually click into accounts payable and go into a menu. Then it'll change into inventory when you switch into inventory. But right at the start, it says applications. So it lists your applications down the left-hand side. And when you scroll or hover over any one of those applications, it will present to you the menu. The menu is very similar to how it's organized in the legacy UI. So you've got kind of the 3-panel setup with headers and specific workflows underneath them. The nice thing about this menu is you also have the ability to hover over each of these items and click the star next to them and mark it as a favorite. All favorites appear next to the application switcher in the global favorites. And that will always show you all of your favorite items that have been marked for all of the modules. So it makes it really easy, and you can rearrange the menu into any order you want. So if you want to put it in workflow order or alphabetical order or most commonly used order, whatever makes the most sense for the way that you work, you now have the ability to do that. So a lot of flexibility there, and that's really nice. The other thing is that now we have, previously you had the open setup down the bottom of the second panel, and then you would open up the third panel, which would have available to you a lot of the configuration and administration options. They've done something similar here. They've split it into all and setup, where setup is going to be a lot of that master data and configuration options, and all is going to be the majority of your workflows. Okay. So the next update is the Advanced Audit Trail. So the Advanced Audit Trail was designed to be a HIPAA solution for those companies that need to comply with that, generally going to be healthcare organizations. So in addition to subscribing to the Advanced Audit Trail, your organization would also need to make sure that you've disabled external access to Sage Intacct, and that you're not storing any protected health information in places other than the contact, vendor, and customer objects. So the audit trail is only going to be tracking the access to those 3 objects and records. So of course that means that you can't have any of that protected data in attachments, custom fields, the employee record, or anywhere else in the system. If your company does have HIPAA compliance requirements and is able to read the audit trail overview, and you think that that sounds like something that you need, and you're able to also adhere to the additional requirements, you are allowed to enter into the Sage Intacct Business Associate Agreement, and that will allow you to have that HIPAA certification. So if that's something that your organization needs, please reach out to us or your account manager at Intacct, and we would be happy to help you with that. So another thing, and kind of keeping up with the regulations that have been put in place in Europe, is GDPR. For those of you that don't know what that stands for General Data Protection Regulation. And for those of you that might be compliant to that, Intacct is now offering a service that helps you manage retention periods of personal data that are stored in your Sage Intacct instance. So in order to enable this, you would request that from Intacct. You would tell them what is the date before you want to obfuscate or mask personal data entered prior to that date. So what will happen is Intacct will basically mask all of that data, and you will not be able to access it, retrieve it, download it, etc. in the future. There is a rather long list of fields that are going to be obliterated or masked in that action. So what Intacct will do is they will create a copy company. They will run the script on that for the date that you have specified, and they will allow you to review all of the data that gets deleted and removed or masked. So if there's anything in your live system that you need to download to make sure that you have access to on a go-forward basis, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Once you allow them to go ahead with that, then they will move that into your production environment. So one of the important things to note is that with the advanced audit trail and the GDPR kind of data management, they are serving fundamentally different purposes, and they are actually at cross purposes. Because the GDPR personal data management service will delete records that are tracked via the advanced audit trail, Intacct at this time is not recommending that you implement both features, one or the other. So just something to be note, if you are subject to both, you may want to consider how you're using your system and which one might be the more appropriate one. And of course, both us and your Intacct account manager would be more than happy to talk through your options there and what may be the best for your organization. Okay, financial graphs. Oh, I think I skipped one. Let me see if I can go back. Sorry about that. So offline job queue administration. So this option is going to be available to anybody that has a premium level of service of silver or higher. Everybody will have access to view the job queue administration, but if you would like to prioritize or cancel items in the queue, you do have to have that premium level of service. And what this allows you to do is if you have a lot of integrations, you're doing CSV imports, you're running your contract invoices, doing a check run, data delivery, if you're using any of the data delivery services for check runs. Global Consolidations is another offline job that's run. This will allow you to look at the queue of all of those offline jobs and rearrange them if necessary so that you can prioritize the work that the system's doing on your behalf while you continue to work yourselves. The ability to sort financial graphs by timeline is actually a really interesting option. So the way Intacct works is they're going to show you default periods in chronological order. So you'd see Q1 2017, then you see Q2 2017, Q3 2017, so on and so forth. So what this allows you to do is to be able to do a trend analysis. So that way you are able to see Q1 2017 compared to Q1 2016 side by side in the same graph, as you can see on the picture here. So in order to do this, you're going to open up your financial graphs. You're going to select your trend comparison and select the reporting period that you would like to compare. And then you'll either expand it by months, quarters, years, whatever your period is there. Select your show trend for in the drop down and select the number of past as a negative number or future as a positive number, periods that you'd like to include in your graph. And if you're doing in a primary data series, you'll select sort by timeline and then refresh it. So this is a neat option, especially as everybody is getting ready to start their Q2 or Q4 if you're a 630 board reporting, that this is a new graph available for you. All right, One of the items I'm most excited about, being in the nonprofit vertical, is the Nonprofit Financial Board Book. So a few years ago, Intacct released what they referred to as the Digital Board Book, which was available for all of the SaaS companies. So the Nonprofit Financial Board Book is a similar offering, but for the nonprofit space. So what it is it's a series of key metric dashboards and reports that are going to provide you insight into your organization's financial health. So it's powered by GuideStar. If you're not familiar with GuideStar, it's the world's largest source of information on nonprofit organizations. And it does standardize it because it generally uses the 990 information to be able to gather and monitor all in one place. So anybody can access GuideStar and get that information from there. So the nice thing about the GuideStar integration is it includes a questions to consider box, I guess, dashboard widget, which will kind of give you some key questions that you might want to consider as you're reviewing these graphs and analyses. It'll also allow you through the financial scan integration to do benchmarks, to learn how you can benchmark your organization against other organizations of similar size and classification as per the NTEE. So the dashboards are included are a financial health dashboard, which includes key metrics on revenue sources and uses, profitability, composition, and liquidity. Balance sheet graphs, which include graphs related to asset composition, useful versus depreciated life of your assets, liability, net assets, composition as well as some liquidity and statistical calculations as well. And then the income statement graph includes information on expense and personnel costs, your major expense categories, estimated fully loaded costs, revenue composition, the difference between contributed revenue versus earned revenue, and any surplus or deficit that you may have. So really exciting to see this partnership with GuideStar presenting itself in this nonprofit financial board book. So to subscribe, you must be using the non-for-profit Quick Start package. So if you are not using the not-for-profit Quick Start package, unfortunately, you will not be able to subscribe to the nonprofit financial board book. If you are, it is based off of the standard categories. So if you have an older implementation, anything prior, if you were implemented prior to 2016, you may need to revisit some of the categories and how you have your account set up to be able to map to the financial board book. So if you were implemented prior to 2016, you will probably need implementation assistance to get everything updated. However, if you are a newer Intacct client, you may be able to implement this yourselves. You may want to call us just to check or have a conversation in case there's anything additional in there that we want to review with you prior to letting you loose on there. Okay, moving on to accounts payable. So there's a couple updates. So I had mentioned at the top of the webinar that there are a few instances where there are workflows now that are only available in the new Action UI. And the Pay Bills feature, oftentimes referred to as the AP Workbench, is one of those features. It's a really great improvement on the Select Bills to Pay workflow. It allows a lot more flexibility to be able to filter and sort and find particular bills, especially if you are in a high volume AP environment. That can be particularly helpful. The other thing that it does really well is allows you to apply credits much more easily. So this is a new improvement to the Pay Bills functionality. And one of the functionalities in the Pay Bills workflow is if you are not ready to do your check run or finalize your payments at that time, you have the ability to add things to an outbox. So you can kind of add things to your check run throughout the week and then make sure that you do your check run, at the end of the week. So when you add things to the outbox in the previous version prior to this release, if you added a vendor bill for Armanino 3 days ago and then you added another one, it would cut 2 checks instead of combining them, even if your preference was to have all of the invoices consolidated onto one check to save your check stock. So with this release, they've given you the option. So if you already have a draft payment request sitting in your outbox, you'll get this pop up that you're seeing on the screen here. So it'll know that you've already selected a vendor that matches by the vendor name, the payment date, the payment method, the bank, and the currency. So Intacct will check for that. It'll see that it matches, and then it'll give you the option. Do you want to merge this payment request with the one that's already in there and cut 1 check? Or do you want to have it cut 2 checks? So you'll have that option. You select merge or don't merge, and then it'll add it to your outbox appropriately. If, on the other hand, you already have 2 checks in there for Armanino and you're adding a third one, it would present to you which one you wanted to add it to. So in some cases, you may want to cut multiple checks, but 2 on this one, 1 on the other. So it'll allow you that flexibility. So that's a nice improvement. The next release item that we have is the ability to use the pay to contact to merge bills. So the nice thing about this is you can merge selected payments into one draft payment in the outbox. So the option, so there's 2 new options here. So merge requests into one per vendor, merge request into one vendor pay to contact. So the difference between these 2 options now is that the merge request into one per vendor will look to the pay to contact of the vendor record, regardless of what you may have chosen on the bill itself. Versus the merge request into one per vendor pay to contact is going to look to the pay to contact from the bill and not the vendor record. So you have the flexibility if you've got vendors that have multiple addresses, if you want to do it to the pay to address on the vendor record or the pay to addresses that may have been noted on the bill to on the bill itself. So a lot more flexibility on where you're going to be sending this payment and also for merging purposes. The last update in accounts payable today is related to the American Express ACH payment services. So prior to this release, you did not have to provide Intacct with the name on the account or the address of the bank. And they are now making this required as that needs to be printed on your not to file or on the checks, depending on what ACH payment service you're using. So if you are subscribed to both ACH and check delivery, with this release, Intacct will have automatically copied the name on the account and address information from your check delivery screen over to the ACH payment screen. However, if you are only subscribed to the ACH payment screen, you will need to update that yourself and make sure that you go in and get that before you do any further ACH updates. Okay, contracts, over to you, Greg.
Right, thanks, Brenda. So the first thing that we're going to look at is Intacct's expanded the capability or given us capability to control when the contract line books with a new GL posting field. And what you're able to do now is on the contract line, you can have a separate GL posting date that's different than the contract line start date. That also gives us other capabilities to deal with where you're dealing with dating that it needs to take into bill in advance period or where it occurs in a closed period. So you can see on the screen that there's on the contract line that there is a GL posting field that you can now you can put in. One of the requirements is that GL posting that the period must be open in order for it to be able to post. One other thing that we would refer you to is please refer to the release notes. There is a number of detailed information about how that GL posting date and the start line date, the start date reacts with either the revenue schedules or the billing schedules. All right. Intacct is also in the contract module now made the ability to defer revenue until a performance obligation is delivered. So many times you have a situation where you may be selling a subscription, for example, and that you can't start recognizing the revenue until a certain configuration or services have been performed and met. And so the key takeaway here is that one, it's only currently available for straight line templates, and you need to set up the items where the default contract delivery status is undelivered, and then you then can use the more actions capability on either the contract line if you need to mark it by line, or if you have multiple lines, you can use the more actions at the contract level and mark the items to be delivered. All right. Convert a revenue schedule posting from manual to automatic. Many times when you're first starting out either on the contract modules or maybe just first starting out on a particular contract, you like to set things up so that you're controlling them manually, the posting of it and the moving of the contract through its steps. And previously Intacct, when you set something up manually, it stayed manually then for the life of the contract. So now Intacct has given us the option to take a manual schedule and convert it to automatic. And so you can, from the contract lines, again, the common theme here, there's more actions, and you can select the contract conversion line posting type to automatic, and then and you select the schedules and the effective date, and you can also do it from the entire contract on the more actions and select the contract, the entire contract, and convert the schedule posting type. Two key takeaways is you cannot change back from automatic to manual, and you also cannot use a date in a closed period. So contract renewal enhancements. So there's a couple things that Intacct has made available. They've made some improved email notifications, so you're able to better specify when a customer is notified on a contract renewal, and they've also exposed some additional merge fields on the child renewal contract to make it easier to put that information into the email. You also have the ability to now select how far in advance that you want to bill on renewals, and you can determine when customers should be notified and billed for contract renewals. So let's take a look at the renewal template. So in the renewal template now, you have the ability here to specify for the customer email that you're sending to them the number of days, and if it's before or after. Similarly, you have the capabilities on an internal email to be able to control the dates. Let's look at the bill in advance. So on the bill in advance feature depends on whether it's an existing contract or a new contract. So under existing contracts, you have the ability to go into the contract line information and specify information as to how that billing in advance should happen. So you get some nice messages from Intacct regarding the number of days and the frequency. And then on a new contract, you can go in on a new contract, and under the renewal section, when you set up that new contract, you can specify the renewal bill in advance dates and the number of the frequency of how far in advance that you want something to renew. Next, we want to talk about the ability to uncancel a contract. So for you golf fans out there, Intacct has given us a mulligan or a do-over. So you have the ability, if you if you canceled a contract inadvertently, you now have the ability to go back and uncancel it. And that the requirement is that the revenue recognition method cannot be quantity-based, project percent complete, or task percentage complete based. So you have the ability to open the contract, use the More Actions button, and click on uncancel the contract, and then you need to review all the schedules and edit as applicable. And then you also have the ability to do it on a contract line. One of the key takeaways is that if revenue was posted prior to cancellation, the system's going to is going to summarize the unrecognized amounts with a scheduled posting date equal to the cancellation date. And if you uncancel the contract line because you wanted to continue recognizing as before, you're going to need to go in and manually edit the revenue schedules and get them set up the way you want. And if you uncancel the contract because the cancellation date required you to prorate the revenue and you did not do this beforehand, there's some very detailed instructions. You can look in Intacct Help under before canceling a contract schedule, and it'll walk you through the information as to the number of steps you need to deal with to make sure that then you have the ability to properly prorate the revenue. MEA Allocations Enhancements. So sometimes we come across circumstances where there's no real way to establish a fair value. So Intacct has given us some additional capabilities here. And the first scenario is that if you've got only one item has no fair value, Intacct is going to take and calculate. It's going to take the extended transaction value of the bundle less the extended fair value of the bundle, and that'll equal the residual value, and then the residual value is going to equal the MEA amount for you. So it will do that. It will do that calculation in that fashion. If you have more than one item that has no fair value on that particular contract, it's going to take the extended value of the bundle less the extended fair value of the bundle to equal the residual value, and then it's going to take a percentage relationship of the values of each of the lines and calculate a residual percentage as a percentage, and then it's going to take the residual value times the residual percentage to get you the MEA amount. Then, in addition to that, Intacct's given us can we go back one slide, please? So in addition, Intacct's given us the capabilities to address a situation where the percentages are not working. The percentages are resulting in amounts that are not exactly what you want to, and now Intacct has given us the ability to go in and override the MEA amount. Please note that the percentages will not change on the system. You just enter the dollar amounts that you want to assign. Also, Intacct's now added an additional percentage of completion thresholds for project revenues, and it's involved when you're using the either project or task-based recognition methods, and what you can do is set the threshold. So in this example here, you can see that we have threshold amounts that are 35, 65, and 100, and then you're saying that you have a percentage that you want to recognize. So when the threshold reaches 35, it will then recognize 30% of the revenue. And it won't do any additional revenue recognition until the threshold gets to 65 or higher for the next step. So just a very nice feature to allow you to set a step revenue threshold recognition. And back to Brenda.
Excellent, thank you. So for the Salesforce integration, this is the advanced CRM integration. So if you are using that integration, there's a number of enhancements that have been done, and it's primarily on the Salesforce side this time. So now in Salesforce, you can select more than one record type to use for contract transactions. Previously, you could only select one. So this is a big enhancement that a lot of people were looking forward to. You can also select more than one record stage to indicate when an opportunity is ready to be created and Intacct. So if you have several different opportunity stages that may sync at different times or for different workflows that you have in there, that is also going to be helpful for that. The Renewals tab is updated to present information in a more useful way. They've grouped like things together on that menu page. So now you'll notice that it has been moved around, but all the fields have been preserved. You also now have the ability to use the customized valuations to pick and choose the validations that are going to be used on opportunities, opportunity products, and contracts. So before, you either had validations on or off, and it validated everything. So most people ended up having it off. So now that you have the ability to customize those validations, it's a lot more flexibility. And the last thing is you can now allow accounts to sync to entities independent from transactions. So for example, if you wanted to sync an account to the root level of Intacct, the top level there, but also wanted to sync transactions associated with that account to a specific entity in Intacct, you can now allow this to happen by syncing accounts prior to transaction. It's a selection that you have in the Intacct Salesforce setup screen. So that will cause the account to sync to the entity specified in the Intacct entity field on the account record. So for those of you that have master data at the top level and transactions at the entity level, this is also a welcome enhancement. So in terms of other integration enhancements we have here, we now have a bi-directional sync for contract line items enabled for custom mappings. So you can see here, we have the sync rule has now been changed to bi-directional instead of to Intacct or to Salesforce. You do have that option now. Print as field has been added to the account object as field mapping. So the nice thing about that is if you have a different account name and a print as name to make sure that you're selecting the correct household or making sure that for folks that may have multiple setups in Salesforce for various reasons, you can still have that print as field come over as intended. Another welcome enhancement is the default values for start and end date previously did not auto-populate. You had to re-enter that information. So now on the order entry opportunities, they will populate with the service start and end date. So you can still go in and manually override them, but for the most part, they're always going to be the same. So it'll save you some keystrokes when you're entering in those opportunities there. And then the last thing is in terms of bill in advance fields, they've been added to the contract object and field mapping. So in line with the enhancements for the contracts module overall, the integration has also been enhanced. Okay, platform and web services. So some of you may have customization services instead of platform services. And these updates, I think, are applicable to customization and platform events because this first one here is related to smart events. And what this enhancement is previously you were allowed to enter in a smart event with an API call that did not have any API call in the API body screen. So what that meant is that it was pretty much inactive. So it wasn't actually executing anything. The other item is for smart event emails. So when you select that, when this happens in the system, you want the system to trigger an email. Previously, the email subject was not required. So that was problematic for a lot of people's spam filters. So now they have made the email subject a required field. So if your customization service package or platform package includes any of these conditions that may not have been filled out, going forward, you will need to make sure you fill those out. So the other enhancement here is condition requirements will no longer allow you to write a condition that can result in a divide by zero value. So for example here, you can, if you had something that you said, I want to take my invoice price and divide by invoice quantity, invoice quantity could be zero because there are instances where the system will allow you to have a price but no quantity and vice versa. So you would have to update that condition to say where the invoice quantity does not equal zero, then take invoice price divided by quantity. So that way you'll be able to never result in an error for a divide by zero type error. For those of you that are using web services, which would be anybody that has an integration in the system, there's a number of enhancements related to web services in this particular update. So previously, web services users were standard users, and there was an additional checkbox down the bottom of the user record, which meant that they were allowed to be also a web services user. So they could take that login, they could log in regularly, and they could also do the API calls. If you wanted to limit them to the API calls, you could check that box, and it would only allow them to access it via the web service. So they would not be able to log into the UI. So since this checkbox was difficult to find, especially if you're managing a lot of users, what Intacct has done now is they have moved all of the web services users to a different menu line item. And so it makes it much easier. So how they decided what to move was looking at historical data going back about 6 months. They moved anybody that had done, any user record that had done an API call over to the web services users. So of course the risk there is that you have web services users that are still listed on your user list that didn't get automatically moved. So I would really encourage you to review your regular user list and make sure there are not any users on there that should have been moved to web services users only. So once you do that, if you do need to have anything ported, since this is a back-end configuration change, if we are your support provider, you can open a case with us. If Intacct is your support provider, you can open a case with them, and they will port that to the correct user list for you. So one of the enhancements of the web services users is now passwords will remain until the admin resets it, and they cannot have any single sign-on or multi-factor authentication. In practice, this is how it has been working anyways, but now they've just removed that requirement from the user itself. Okay, so similar for web services authorizations. So this is a little bit different than having a user set up itself. So certain third-party marketplace integrations, as well as VARs, if you are purchased your software from us or another VAR, your VAR will have access to your system there. So you can see web services authorizations may have been automatically added based on your historical web services activity. But you can also add specific applications in here. So this also allows access to your system via the API and allows us, it's usually going to be used for, again, for integrations with other marketplace setups or for the integration itself, which is usually using some sort of middleware. So this, instead of on the user tab, this can be found under your company configuration. So in the new UI, I've listed that path here. It's company, all, setup, configuration, and then you can find this all the way at the bottom of the security tab if it needs to be updated. So these, I'm not going to go through all of these. I know this is a lot of text on here. So all this is really telling you is that for all of the updates that we've covered throughout the webinar today and the ones that we still have left to do, they have also updated the web services API calls and given you some additional calls that you now have available with all of these new updates. So if you are using the API, you can read through all of these things here. They're also included on the developer blog. Okay, onward to purchasing. So for purchasing updates, there are 4 key updates for purchasing in this release. And the first one is a new deliver to contact in purchasing transactions. So if you want users to be able to change the deliver to contact on purchasing transaction, you can select the allow editing checkbox. So they've now added a new one in addition to the pay to and return to, which a lot of times you don't want somebody to be able to edit that for various internal controls reasons. But deliver to, a lot of times that may need to be changed because you want it to go to a certain building or a different campus or something like that. So you can now allow editing of a deliver to address. So to do that, you will access your configuration for purchasing, and you'll have to first enable header level deliver to contact. So when those 2 checkboxes are checked, you'll then get the option in the individual transaction definitions to be able to do that there. And you can also specify multiple delivery addresses because it will allow you to do this on the individual line item. So if you're doing a purchasing transaction and one line item needs to be delivered to building A and one line item to building B, you have the ability to be able to specify that. They've also updated the subtotal templates for transaction definitions. So if you're in a multi-entity environment and you need to apply different subtotals to different entities for order entry and purchasing, the subtotal templates will let you apply those for depending on where the transaction is created, at the top level, at the entity level, and you can use one single transaction definition. So before you had to have a unique transaction definition if you needed to apply different percentages. So this is where we're really seeing the Intacct Sage partnership, bringing in and leveraging a lot of that UK experience. So this is primarily intended to be a VAT enhancement. So for those of you operating in an international environment, it's very common that country A has a very different VAT percentage than country B, or even depending on what type of transaction it is, you might have 2 different rates within the same country. So this will now allow you to set up those various different VAT rates using the simple tax within the system. So that's the very nice thing. And you can also have different subtotals applicable to different transaction definitions. And since you're defining these rates in a table, you can link to them in different transaction definitions by only doing one setup. So that's a really nice enhancement for any of you operating in that kind of an environment. Okay, a little bit more on the subtotal templates for transaction definitions. So just like for any column you leave blank in an entity row, if you leave the subtotal template field blank for an entity, the value will default to the subtotals specified for the top level, regardless of whether you specified a subtotal template in the General tab or left the field empty and manually entered the subtotals in the table itself. The important thing to remember here is that once you have enabled subtotal templates, you cannot disable them. However, you don't have to specify the subtotal template in the transaction definition. You can leave it blank and then do things just as you are doing them today. So important to remember, you do have options. Okay, the ability to override the simple tax at the line level. So when you've enabled subtotals, you do have another new option now to enable line level simple tax. So again, this is thinking about VAT. However, if you've got different sales tax rates or things like that, that could also be applicable for you. So for example, you sell item A and item B to the same customer, but they need to be taxed at different rates. Maybe they're being delivered to different jurisdictions, or they've got different VAT types to be able to do that. So with the simple tax override at the line level, you can create one transaction definition defining multiple tax rates in the subtotals, and both items can be entered on the same sales transaction. And then the user can select the appropriate tax rate for each item. So they call it simple tax, but it's probably for advanced users. So if this is something that you're thinking of implementing, we definitely recommend that you reach out to us so that we can kind of do a scoping call and make sure that this is going to fit with your particular use case and business scenarios. All right, back to you, Greg, for projects.
Okay, thank you. So Intacct's made a couple of enhancements in the project. One is simply a name change. The old page used to call it Manage Timesheets. They're now calling it Timesheet Inquiry, and you can see the navigation there. And then likewise, the Manage Resource Schedule is now considered Resource Capacity, and that you can have the all projects, project and resource management and resource capacity as the navigation. The resource schedule feature, or the now called resource capacity, requires that you must have at least project costing to add the resource capacity feature into Intacct. Intacct's also continuing to add additional capability to the project manager user, and one of the things that it's given in this release is the ability for the project manager to draft invoices. And so the key benefit of using draft invoices is that they do not post to the general ledger or to the accounts receivable, and they just simply stay in a non-submitted state that can be then subsequently reviewed, and then so you can have the project manager submit the he can draft the invoice, he can generate the invoice in the draft state, and then the billing specialist then can have or some other financial user that you have can go in and review the draft, approve it, and then actually post the invoice. And so let's take a look at the actual screen here. And so what the project manager user would go in is he would go into the pre-bill report. You can see that on the bottom of the screen there is a saved document as draft, and the individual would then simply click on or preview the invoice, and then he would go in and preview it, make up the changes that need to happen on that particular invoice, and then click create invoice, and it creates it as the draft. It sits out there. You can have a lister page that someone can then go in and look at all the invoices that are in the draft state and go through and finalize them and post them. Inventory continues to be a major area that Intacct is continuing to release features on. They had originally contemplated some of this information coming in the in an earlier in the actual R2 release, and for various reasons, some of the stuff just didn't make it to the release. So they're planning on releasing information. And this is around coming soon, some landed cost capabilities. So the idea being that if you're buying a inventory and have it shipped to you overseas, and you're incurring shipping cost and maybe some broker's fees or other things like that, Intacct will give you a way to be able to add those costs in after the fact to the invoice, the inventory cost. Intacct's also working on the replenishment process within Intacct. So there's going to be a new process allowing better automation of reordering, and this particular feature is contemplated to be released not this weekend but the following weekend. So the other big advantage Intacct has with its software as a service and how it's designed itself is that Intacct is also releasing some off-schedule releases, and so they'll be able to do things, and we won't necessarily have to wait on some features until the next quarterly release. So replenishments is one of the ones that's targeted for an earlier release than next quarter. Intact's also making available a warehouse user type, and so this is this user will, it's going to give you activities, the ability to select various activities in order entry, purchasing, and inventory, and the subscription cost for the warehouse user type will be less than a full business user, and so that gives you the capabilities to effectively use those type of users in your distribution operations. Like I said, these are coming soon. Some things will be out on July 6th. Others will be out over next extended period of time, and some of these features will also come in the R3 in August. Back to Brenda on global consolidations.
All right. This one is one that I've been waiting for a long time. So as I mentioned, there are some things that are only available in the new Action UI. And for those of you using global consolidations, you've probably already realized that this is one of them. So now if you are in the legacy UI, you will no longer have the option for global consolidations. You have to switch over into the new user interface to be able to see it. So there's a lot of enhancements on this. So the one that I'm most excited about is the ability to duplicate a consolidation book. So oftentimes when you're setting up new consolidation books, either to do partial consolidations or to change something about an existing consolidation, you only need to change one small thing. You forgot an account to override, you need to change a rate, something in there is just small. And previously you had to go and create the entire consolidation book from scratch again. So now the ability to duplicate a book, make those few quick changes allows you to really see the impact of those consolidation changes much more quickly than you could prior. So they've also updated the organization view, formerly known as the corporation view. So that's now included in the all section of the menu in the new Action UI. So it's still there, it has just been renamed. One of the other things that they've changed is you can no longer identify your KPIs, your key performance indicators, from within the global consolidation module itself. Instead, you have to designate it in the account groups. So account groups are located in the general ledger. In the new UI, they're also included under the reporting menu. So you can edit account groups right from there. And now there's a checkbox at the bottom of the account groups that just says use as KPI. So if you're subscribed to global consolidations, you'll see that checkbox enabled for you. So you can enable it there, and then you'll be able to see it in your global consolidations. Another awesome thing is you now have the ability to roll up and consolidate statistical journals. Previously, you could only use your financial journals. So now if you've got things like headcount or number of services provided, you have the ability to consolidate those as well. Benefit there, of course, is there's no currency enabled, so there's no translation. It's just going to be strict math. So that's nice as well. And lastly, I think this one, speaking as a former auditor myself, as well as a former controller using Intacct who was subject to audit, one of the things they always request is what rates that you had used for the consolidation and your basis for those rates. And previously, you had to hover over the consolidation to be able to get those rates, and they weren't exportable in any way. So now you're able to export your consolidation history. It's printable, it's exportable, so you can search and display those control processes depending on what your auditors are asking for. So that's a really great enhancement there. All right, so in conclusion today, we have covered a lot of things: reporting and administration, accounts payable, contracts, the Salesforce integration, platform and web services, purchasing, projects, inventory, and global consolidations. We do have a few minutes available here for questions. Megan, have we had any questions come in?
Yes, we do. So thank you, Brenda and Greg. So we have a few questions. If we don't get to your question today, we'll definitely follow up with you after the fact. No worries there. And then, of course, if anyone has any additional questions that you want to send in the interim as well, feel free to put those in now. So the first one, actually, Brenda, I think this one came in while you were discussing the new nonprofit financial board book. So I know you mentioned that they need to be using the not-for-profit Quick Start package. The question from one of our attendees here is, how would they know if they're using that not-for-profit Quick Start package?
Well, that's a great question. So how you'll do it in the new UI, you'll go to applications and then company configuration. Or company setup, I think, in the legacy UI. And then at the bottom of the accounting tab under company information, it'll say setup template. And it will tell you if you have the not-for-profit setup template, it'll say not-for-profit under the setup template. If it says anything else or it says nothing, then you would not be able to use the financial board book. And I can see that that question was asked by Peter, and I can tell you, Peter, you are using the not-for-profit setup template, so you're good to
go. Thank you, Brenda. The next question here is, can you use the new, and actually I think you might have covered this, Brenda, but just to reiterate it, can you use the new merge payments by pay to vendor to merge your multiple credit card vendors and pay as one check?
So this is actually, I was hoping when I saw this was the same question I had as well, that would be kind of a solution. So for any of you who have multiple credit cards set up in your system, you probably already know that Intacct requires a one-to-one-to-one match between the vendor setup, the credit card setup, and the credit card liability clearing account. So in some cases, you have it set up that way, even though you're only paying one bill. So you have to combine all of the payments, pay it off by credit card, and then consolidate it that way. So it takes like 3 extra steps. So I was hoping by being consolidated on vendor name that you could do that. But unfortunately, it does have to be the same vendor, not just the same vendor name. So this would not be a viable solution for merging all of your credit card vendors, unfortunately. Great question.
Thank you. And actually, I think we have time for just about one more. So like I mentioned, if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards. So this last question is, what happens if I go to edit a smart rule or a smart event that does not meet the new criteria?
Does not meet the new criteria. So what that means is if you go to edit it and maybe you're editing something completely unrelated to the new criteria, it will tell you that you can't save it because it does not meet the requirements. You're missing a required field. So if you do want to edit that, you will have to validate the new criteria before you'll be allowed to save it. So anything that does not meet the new criteria is still going to be grandfathered in, but if you need to edit that smart event for any reason, you will have to conform to the new required criteria before you'll be allowed to save that record.
Great, and we are just about out of time, so that does wrap up today's webinar. Thank you to Brenda and to Greg for being our experts on today's webinar. To our attendees, if you have any more specific questions, you are welcome to follow up with Brenda or Greg directly, or anyone here on the Armanino Sage Intacct team. As you exit the webinar today, there is a quick survey, so definitely take a moment to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar. And thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.